through the GBS coaching office. Maybe you've heard our four names, but today, Caitlin and I, two coaches, are presenting with two members of the South English department who are really fantastic and know today's content extraordinarily well with amazing depth. So I'm Marshall Harris. I'm one of the instructional coaches at GBS. And as I mentioned, Caitlin Reichert is also presenting today. She's another one of the instructional coaches at South. And as I mentioned, joining us today, we have Aphrodite Skioris and Austin Smith, two members of the GBS English department. And they are members of our equity cohort. If you work at North or off campus and you're not familiar with that, South has now 2 years of equity cohort membership. And as part of that cohort, people work on equity action projects. And Aphrodite and Austin took on this great project of taking the work of Zaretta Hammond, and you can see her at the cover of her book there, and trying to build almost like an instructional strategy guide for the book that they were going to then share with our colleagues at South. Now, COVID cut that off, and instead of getting discouraged, what they did was they pivoted into working on a guide that's specifically about remote learning. I joined them in that work, and when Caitlin and I started talking about presenting on this topic, we thought we've got to invite Aphrodite and Austin. They just know this stuff so well, and that's what led to today. So we're really excited to talk about these concepts, and we should get started, I think. Let's do it. So if you've been to previous sessions, you've seen this slide before. So we just want to remind you, if this is your very first one, just to respectfully ask that you mute your mic or stay muted if you're already muted. Just cuts down on background noise. It's helpful to keep things quiet. But if you have questions or comments, certainly type those in the chat as we go. There's 4 of us presenting, so we should be able to keep an eye on that and answer your questions pretty easily. And if there's something you want to ask us that is pressing, by all means, unmute your mic and interrupt us, ask us those questions. We, of course, trust your judgment. And then afterwards, we'll stick around for about 10 minutes. So if you want to chat, talk about the specifics of your course or your kids, for sure, we're happy to do that. So we'll stick around till about 10 after. We also just wanted to remind you that all sessions are being recorded and will be posted later. So after all the sessions have been run, we will post those in a single spot along with PDF collections of the Google Slides. So for your reference, those will be there. Also, don't forget that at the end of the session, we're going to share an attendance and feedback form with you. And the district has said that in order to get paid for your attendance today, you've got to fill that out. It only takes a few minutes if this is your first session. So just make sure you do that. And then, of course, the coach's office and also other offices, both from GBN and district, are offering all kinds of additional sessions this summer. So please be on the lookout for those. The coaches sessions are actually starting to repeat. We have a set of 7, I believe. Yeah, 7. No, I'm sorry. We have 13 total sessions, and we are about to start repeating those. So if you see signups and the topics look familiar, just be aware they might be some that you've already been to. Okay, so let's talk about today's agenda. Here's what we hope to accomplish. We want to overview the foundations and research behind culturally responsive teaching. We know some of you have probably read Hammond's book. Others of you, maybe this is the first you're even hearing of that book. So we're going to do an overview or review of some of the concepts just to give you a foundation that will help you engage in the strategies. And we're going to talk about 13 useful strategies from Zaretta Hammond's research and how they can be useful and modified for the remote learning environment. And then we also are going to give you some time to reflect and share. We want to give you some time in some small groups later in the session so that you can chat with colleagues. So let's jump into some key Hammond ideas. One is this notion of sense of belonging and just how important it is. Specifically, the idea that relationships are not a touchy-feely add-on, nor are they the end point. You can see this quote from her. They're really the on-ramp to deeper learning. And what she talks about, and you can see the title of her book is Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. She really talks about the brain science that's involved in sense of belonging. The idea being, if you think about Maslow, right, that really without that first foundational set of needs being met, kids cannot engage fully in true learning. And what she talks about is there's a connection between culture and sense of belonging that if we can be attentive to it as educators, we can really help kids who are from historically marginalized groups. So she really emphasizes that the work here is done through an equity lens. Some people read the strategies that are involved in her book and they say, oh, well, that's just good teaching for all kids. And while that is certainly true, what Zaretta Hammond really emphasizes in her book is that some kids need an extra dose of these strategies and that it's on us to provide that. You maybe have seen this slide before, the notion that equality is that everybody gets the same thing, but that equity is that everybody gets what they need, right? And so on the left, everybody gets the same box, they get equal treatment, but the kid on the right cannot see over the fence. But in the right frame, they all get what they need, and then all three kids can see over the fence. You maybe have seen a version of this slide where one of the children is short in height. And what I really love about this one is that it's not about the kid, it's about the hill, right? That's keeping that child from seeing over the fence. It's a much better representation because the hill is the system, right? It's not the kid's fault, it's the system that's given that kid that disadvantage. So Hammond really emphasizes that these strategies are particularly useful and important for those kids who have been put on the lower part of the hill because of history and systems. So this is just kind of a great quote from her that I think drives home the point. We are not just building trust with students of color, we are rebuilding trust. We are fixing broken trust. So her research shows that in general, kids who are not from marginalized community come in to your classes with a dose of trust in the system and with you as a teacher that kids who are from marginalized groups might just not have and most likely don't have. And so we have to do extra work to build that trust. So when she gets into the neuroscience, what she talks about is two particular chemicals in the brain. Cortisol is the stress chemical. It's released in fight or flight. And what she emphasizes is that when a student experiences a cortisol spike, it can take 3 hours for that student to regain half of their ability to learn. And if you think about a school day, right, that's ages, right? Think about 8 o'clock in the morning, that child has that moment, and by lunchtime, they've got half of their ability to learn back. Now, the implication is not that every single kid from every marginalized group is experiencing huge fight or flight cortisol spikes, but if they feel alienated, if they feel marginalized, they might feel a steady low dose of cortisol, which inhibits learning. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is the brain chemical that's the lean-in hormone, right? So when kids feel connected, when they feel that sense of belonging, that particular hormone allows them to really lean into learning, to engage, which of course is going to help them with their overall achievement. So with that introduction in mind, what we want to get into is how do you create that sense of belonging, that opportunity to increase oxytocin and decrease cortisol for kids. So we're going to go through a bunch of strategies, 13 to be exact, and then we're going to use breakout rooms afterwards for you to discuss and reflect. And so we want you to go into these strategies just with these three questions in mind. What ideas could work in your classroom? What questions do you have about the ideas being covered? And then do you have additional strategies, maybe things that you know have worked for you particularly with kids from marginalized communities, that you would share with your colleagues? So just kind of have those 3 questions in mind as we go through. And Aphrodite is going to get us started with this set of strategies.
So as Marshall said, we're going to go through 13 strategies, and just be mindful of the fact that we're pressed for time. So we're not going to go through every single bullet point necessarily that's written on the slides, but because we wanted to spend our verbal time to just discuss, make sure we drive the point home for certain things. So feel free to look at those slides on your own as well if we don't cover every bullet point. So the first thing a culturally responsive teacher will do is to show their authentic personality. Because the student-teacher relationship is so important, one of the strongest ways to build it, according to Hammond, is for a teacher to show what Hammond calls selective vulnerability. In order to build trust with students, a teacher needs to show their values, their passions, and share selected bits of what is happening within their own psyches, which takes true vulnerability. We ask that we notice the word selective. Building this type of authentic relationship is not just about being friends with students and sharing every detail of our personal lives, or just sharing superficial pictures of vacations or kids or our dogs, but rather giving students a glimpse into vulnerable moments they could learn from, like, for example, admitting a mistake and apologizing when something goes wrong, or sharing about a moment in your life when you had to make a life-changing decision and the thought process that went into it. Some ways to show such authenticity during e-learning is to record a non-instructional video discussing a passion, or discussing a mistake you recently made during a synchronous session, or to even use some of the time allotted in the session to just laugh together with students. That type of authenticity and vulnerability will help build that trust and foster a sense of belonging with students. While it is important to show authenticity, a culturally responsive teacher would also be aware enough of cultural differences and dynamics to avoid inadvertently committing a microaggression during discussions or videos, or not addressing when they hear a microaggression occur in any area of class. A microaggression, if you didn't know, is an indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. One personal challenge would be to be mindful of those types of microaggressions that tend to happen in school environments. One example is name pronunciation. At GBS, we have a largest Mongolian population whose names can be intimidating and difficult to pronounce for native English speakers. A teacher or a student who does not want to learn how to pronounce a student's preferred name, or mispronounces even after being corrected several times, or gives a nickname that was not asked for by the student, whether or not the student fights back. Because in that situation, if a teacher says, I'm going to call you blank, the kid's going to go along with it, you know, in most cases. That is an example of a microaggression. So when you get this presentation via email, if this is an area you'd like to explore more to build on that awareness level, we have included a link to some common microaggressions that happen in schools. And it would be totally worthy to take a look at those so we don't alienate our students from historically marginalized groups.
Thanks, Aphrodite. So number 2 brings us to, we want to show interest in students as individuals. So as Marshall had stated earlier, we're using these relationships that we develop with students as an on-ramp to learning. So we need to make sure that our students have a sense of belonging within our classrooms so they're ready to engage in the material. And we can do this in a number of different ways. And obviously one of the most important is being able to talk and listen to our students. So we can do that through a variety of methods. We can make use of conferences. We can also use discussion circles. And during these conversations we have with students, yes, we can talk about course content, but at sometimes it's important to even put course curriculum and content on hold and just talk about the students as who they are as people, what interests them, or maybe something that's going on in the community that has their attention. So we want to listen to those needs of our students. We want to empathize with them about what they're feeling. These personal conversations we have too can also help us get to that deeper culture of our students. Likewise, as we're getting to know our students and we incorporate some of their interests in our classes, we also want to show that we're listening to them by acting on the feedback they provide to us. So that means we actually have to seek feedback from them. We can do that through surveys, But also it's nice too at the end of a lesson to have a conversation with the students. Ask them what worked for them, or ask them if there's anything that could be done better, and then to actually act on that for in the future. And a nice little personal challenge you can take for yourself is to try to describe each student using 5 verbs or nouns, and that'll tell you how well you know them.
Almost forgot to unmute. All right, number 3, send and respond to emails empathetically instead of punitively. We really want teachers to be mindful about how they send and respond to emails. So some possibilities. First, you can try to develop a strong rapport with new students at the start of the semester. This will be the foundation behind your emails for the rest of the school year. Next, teachers can also use a combination of high expectations while also delivering empathy to students, which is known as being a warm demander. This is something Zaretta Hammond writes about in her text. It's a way to interact with students that shows high expectations while also bringing empathy. Next, before addressing academic concerns via email, teachers should try to start with, how are you? How can I help you? How are you doing? Or some type of non-academic question first. This approach is not only a best practice, but it's a strategy in love and logic teaching as well. So try to say this at the start of an email, even if you're really frustrated with a student, they're not getting the work in, or they're not sort of demonstrating the skills that you know they have. By starting with this, you'll show empathy and build their trust within the student, and it'll improve your relationship for the future. So next, you can adopt this mindset that students are doing their best before you make assumptions. This is especially important for students who are in a population of students who have been historically marginalized. I've seen some emails where an adult immediately started telling the student they were missing work, they were lacking in a certain area during e-learning, and it was all academic talk. And while the teacher's valid reason for emailing about the work was definitely true, when reading that email from a student perspective, it might just feel like the teacher solely focused on academic concerns, and they may not really care about what the student's going through or noting the student's overall well-being. And then a final note within this idea is that if you really need to discuss consequences or a tough topic or a difficult situation with a student, make your best effort to have that conversation over video chat or by phone. And while we definitely know this is not always possible in remote learning, it's really important to strive to achieve this, because empathy and the human connection is much better felt when you can see or hear the person instead of just reading their words. And we know that a student could easily misinterpret our words in that situation, especially around a tough topic.
The next thing a culturally responsive teacher will do is use a chosen online platform to include opportunities for interaction between peers. Collaboration between students that is structured and includes high expectations fosters learning and engagement and is attentive to collectivist cultural norms. The US tends to be very individualistic. That idea does not always fit with every learning style and every culture group that exists within our country. So paying attention to those collectivist norms would be really significant for certain groups of students. While collaborating to get tasks done is important, to really foster a sense of belonging, particularly amongst historically marginalized groups, is to also build into the classroom opportunities for students to connect on a human level. Who knows, they might find out something about each other they didn't know, or perhaps a new friendship will be formed. During e-learning, teachers could use synchronous session breakout rooms and tell students to spend 2 or 3 minutes discussing something they struggled with over the weekend, or something they enjoy doing, or something they're looking forward to. And then the students can get into the academic work. Teachers could also perhaps use asynchronous Flipgrid videos to allow for that interaction. These can be done in writing as well using Google Docs. Somewhere in the e-learning schedule, teachers can include and should include opportunities for structured virtual teaching and reflection between students to help move students towards being independent learners. That independent learner piece is the most significant goal of a culturally responsive teacher. It's not really just being nice to everybody and being inclusive. It's really moving them towards the goal of being an independent learner. If you want to know more about tools to use to host synchronous and asynchronous discussions, the GBS coaches have offered sessions on asynchronous discussion, and the synchronous discussion one repeats on the 13th of August.
All right, that brings us to number 5. So culturally responsive teachers will address multiple learning styles by including both written and verbal directions. So if we think about when we're in the classroom and face-to-face instruction, we don't just hand a project or an assignment off to a student and say, go with it, right? Usually we spend some time, we go through the criteria, perhaps we look at a rubric together, and we might even look at some samples or models. So yes, we want our students to become independent learners, but we also don't want to just leave them drowning with an assignment. So when we're reviewing our work with students, we want to make sure that we're sharing our screen when discussing the assignment and sharing the content. Point students in the directions of models if you have them. Also, you might consider supplemental videos to support how to complete assignments. And you can record those through a number of platforms. And many of those platforms, you don't even need to have your face on the recording if you don't feel comfortable. It's also really important to consider how we check for understanding as we teach. So you can make use of emojis. There's different nonverbal cues you can ask for. If you are in that participant bar on your screen, there's also different yes, no's, and raising hand to check. And you can even stop for a quick think, pair, share to make sure that students are understanding the work that needs to be completed.
The next strategy we have to share is that culturally responsive teachers will also set expectations for how online communication should happen. Communicating expectations clearly is significant because we cannot take for granted that all students have these types of communication skills and know exactly what to do and how to do it. Even seniors, who I was shocked, in e-learning in the spring, I'm like, really? Like, you're about to graduate and there's so many things that if I didn't clearly and explicitly state, they wouldn't have known they needed to do. In previous sessions, the instructional coaches have asked that we set expectations in terms of 3 words. Act, what do you want your students to be doing? Talk, what kind of talking should be happening? And space, what expectations do you want your students to know about in terms of their physical space, background, or clothing? We would also like to share some additional questions to help set up expectations each time students will communicate with each other. Questions like how, when, why, where, and what behavior is acceptable. If we define these expectations for ourselves and effectively and clearly communicate them to our students using our online spaces, they are more likely to succeed as students and learners.
All right, number 7, we want to provide instruction for students about digital organization and emails. So if you pause for a second and think about your own class, think about all the technology tools you use in there. Now imagine you're a student and you've got 5 or 6 other classes. That can really become a lot of different technology tools to manage and to try to use on a weekly basis. And that doesn't even take into account the different technologies they have in their homes, like their cell phones, TVs, different video game systems, whatever they might have. So it can become overwhelming, and it can also become a major, a barrier to learning. So we want to make sure that we help students navigate these different technologies. With that being said, we don't want to assume that they know how to already use these different technology platforms that we're using within our classrooms. So we need to make sure that we actively teach our students how to use them. Likewise, we want to use a lot of think alouds to accomplish this. So consider talking to students about a digital routine. Maybe you teach them or walk students through where you set up your own workspace so you can really focus and not be distracted by the different technologies. Of course, email is also going to become really important during e-learning. So we want to teach students how to keep an inbox clean and also how to write a good email because, well, not everyone knows how to do that. Likewise, there's other technology tools such as how to use the calendar, there's the bookmarks feature, and also even organizing Google Drive. It's important to remember as we're thinking about these different technology tools think about those skills that can transfer between different tech platforms or even between different situations that are going to help our students succeed. Because again, we don't want that technology to be a barrier. You might even consider, obviously we have good ideas as adults, but many students have figured out how to work through the technology. So let them teach each other what works for them, because that's another good way to give students voice in the classroom.
So the eighth strategy we want to talk about today is the inclusion of diverse voices within assignments whenever possible in your class. And we know, and Hammond acknowledges, that this is certainly easier in some disciplines than in others. We don't want to be dismissive of that idea, but we want to give you just a few ideas of how you might think about doing this. So first of all, including images of content creators with the content in your class could be a really good idea. In the digital space, this might even be easier because you're not printing out a bunch of stuff. You can include those images in the digital materials that you give kids. But it's important, of course, to not just include Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color when you use photos. Use photos of all of your content creators, because obviously if you only do it when it's people from historically marginalized groups, then kids maybe would feel otherized by that. Oh, I'm only seeing images when it's people who look like me. So by including images all the time, you give kids a sense of who the content creators are, and you show that there's a diversity of influencers and contributors within your content area. The reason why the images might matter is that names themselves or names alone might not indicate to kids the diversity of those content creators. So the images help to make that really clear. If you are from a discipline where it's not necessary that the content creator is a particular voice, the way that it might be in an English classroom, for example. Think about historical figures from your discipline who maybe wouldn't have written something in the textbook or might not even be covered in a textbook, but that you could bring in additional materials to talk about those individuals. For example, I love the story of Gladys West, and she could be someone who's useful in a math and science class. Her programming research and expertise was used to invent GPS, basically, right? So could you find a way to incorporate some of her history and her contributions into classes that involve mathematical models or physics or geography? I think all of those could be relevant. So in humanities classrooms specifically, it could be at very much part of the core content, right? So English teachers, social studies teachers, fine arts teachers, world languages teachers, the content creators that you include in your classroom, it lends itself very naturally to you being inclusive. For STEM classes and PE and CTE, it might be a little bit more of a challenge for you because, again, content creators are not necessarily central to your classes. And so, again, think about how you might use materials that connect the skills and the knowledge that you're going through with kids to the real world. Even if it's not about historical figures, it could be about social issues of the day and journalists of color who are commenting on topics that are related to current events or social issues. Though that kind of approach can, again, increase that sense of belonging, make kids feel connected in ways that they might not otherwise, and allow them to lean into the learning.
The next thing a culturally responsive teacher will do is give choices for how students express their understanding. One of the most important elements of being culturally responsive is to actually push students to see their gifts, to develop their talents, and to become more independent learners. Giving choices places more responsibility on the student and allows the student opportunities to demonstrate what they can do in their own way. Choices empower students by allowing students to make decisions and prove their understanding in ways that make sense for them. Teachers can provide the choices, but I know I've talked to a lot of people about choice, and many feel it is a burden to try to develop different project ideas themselves. And I have certainly felt that way. I'm like, I have no more ideas left to give. At that point, then I just took a step back. And, all our job is to establish our learning target. Once we have our learning target and we have taught it the way that we do, at that point, once it's been established, a student then can be given the choice to demonstrate their understanding of said target by writing a poem if they're verbal stylists, maybe creating a video if they prefer to talk instead of write, and maybe creating an infographic or a painting if they're visually inclined. While there is value in the formal essay using quotes that I will continue to teach because I'm supposed to, and the traditional test, space can be created for more choice as well. Since traditional testing methods won't be as secure during e-learning, I think this is just a great time for students to experiment with different forms to show what they have learned and where they need to grow.
That brings us to number 10. Culturally responsive teachers will spend more time on kids who are not naturally engaged. So we can probably all think of those students who are constantly raising their hands in class, staying after class to talk or coming in early to chat. I'm not saying that we ignore those students, but we got to look at the other end of the spectrum, because we've got those students who aren't naturally engaged that we need to spend more time on to help them feel that sense of belonging. So something to be careful of is making assumptions about why these students aren't naturally engaged. It could be for a whole host of reasons, right? It could be maybe they have anxiety, something going on at home. It could be because they just don't like us. We don't know. We don't want to make those assumptions, because those assumptions are being driven by our own biases. So that can be really dangerous if we fall into that trap of making those assumptions. With that being said, we need to make sure that we get to know these students better to help pull them into the classroom. So we want to remember the importance of extending invitations. We want to make sure we're reaching out to kids. Consider writing emails, or at the end of a synchronous session, ask a student to stay behind and talk to them. You don't even just have to talk about school. It could just be about them as a person. So you might consider using the 2x10 strategy, which is the idea of talking to a student for 2 minutes for 10 different days to get to know more about them. And additionally, as we get to know more about our students, we need to think about how we can support them and serve as a facilitator with them. So think about how you can connect the students to different resources, whether those be human resources like a counselor or a club sponsor, but also material resources such as the TLC or the library. And a good personal challenge I always like to think about is, sometimes we've got those kids who aren't naturally engaged, and we make those assumptions, but then we should pause and ask ourselves, well, how much do I really know about this person or about this thing? So challenge yourself to name 5 positive things about that student, because if you can't, then you're probably missing something about them, and we should work to get to know them better.
As mentioned earlier, the most important goal of a culturally responsive teacher is to mentor students to become independent learners. One of the best ways to do that is to do strategy number 11, which is to share learning moves for success and be explicit about transferable skills. Teachers have their own learning habits, and sharing those would help students maybe to adopt them for themselves. For example, I love a good daily checklist. I could take a couple of minutes during a synchronous session to share with students how I personally stay organized. Perhaps this will inspire someone. Last spring, one of my seniors on the second day of e-learning, so it was his first goal day, he had already gone through a blue day, shared with me via a letter I had assigned for them how he stayed organized. He said, look, after the first day I got so confused, I started writing down all my assignments at the end of the day, and I crossed them off the list as he completed them. And also a student I would have assumed never would have done that. Like if you had asked me if this was the kid who would write down all of his e-learning assignments, I never would have guessed this kid would be the one. So as I started getting a lot of responses of kids like, I'm so overwhelmed, I don't know how to organize my time, I kept saying like, hey, one of my seniors, just told me that he just wrote down on the list as soon as he checked every agenda in classroom and then crossed them out. And the amount of students who said, oh, I never thought of that. Thank you. I'll start doing it was astounding to me because I thought it was so obvious, you know, as like a daily checklist maker. But we can't take for granted that kids know how to do such things, even such things as simple as like, well, seemingly simple to us, writing things down and then crossing them out. We can also help students identify their own learning moves by including reflection portions to our major assignments, which can be done online. Students can also share their own learning moves with their classmates in a breakout Zoom session. Students identifying their own learning moves will help with transference of skills too. Perhaps we might have to slow down a lesson to include time for students to identify their own learning moves. I know that that sounds so intimidating going into possibly all e-learning when we're already losing so much time, but we have to change our thinking just around what's important and what isn't during this time. Something else that would help a student feel that sense of belonging, particularly a student from a historically marginalized group, is if teachers explicitly explain how they can grow as learners within a system that has not always supported them. By demystifying learning growth for all of our students, we can help them become independent learners. The challenge here is to think deeper than, well, do your homework and you will succeed, because doing homework is not necessarily a learning move all of the time. Sometimes yes, but not all of the time. It's sometimes a compliance move. And even so, that advice doesn't help a student get to the root of a problem. So perhaps setting up a private Zoom meeting with a struggling student to explain how they could exceed expectations with a specific skill will help.
So number 12, culturally responsive teachers will give consistent, meaningful, timely feedback and provide extra time for students to process it. So it's really important for us to think of some possibilities when giving feedback. First, it's great to provide clear routines and structures for giving feedback to students so they know how to expect it from you as their teacher. And consistency is really key here. So sticking with the same structure and the way that you give feedback, because they'll be in many different classrooms that have different ways that they receive feedback. This is just a general tip for e-learning. Next, try to think about how to make your feedback actionable for the student. So Zaretta Hammond suggests that when students are receiving feedback, they only grow if they take that feedback and apply it to a learning situation or a learning move. So when they're given that feedback, it actually, and they use it properly to engage their learning, it stimulates actual brain growth like neurons and dendrites for that student, which is pretty cool. Next is a really cool culturally responsive strategy that Hammond specifically writes about in her text, which is about delivering feedback wisely. This is a particularly useful strategy during e-learning because we as teachers can't necessarily give students face-to-face feedback or in the moment like we're typically used to in the traditional classroom setting. So it can also be easily translated over to email if you need to give students feedback via email. So there are 3 steps to giving wise feedback, as Hammond says. First, you as the teacher will state your high expectations and standards within the content. So you're sharing that you do have high expectations and standards. Next, the next step, number 2, is to immediately follow up with showing assurance in your belief that the student can not only handle the work that you're giving, but you also believe that they can improve their skills in this area. And then the final step of the feedback is that you would give actionable steps to the student that they would need to take in order to be successful. So if you use all 3 of these steps, in turn, it will help kids accept feedback and take it in a concrete way to grow in their understanding and knowledge. And then lastly, when delivering feedback in a synchronous setting, make sure you give students ample physical and verbal time to process. So students may be processing at a slower pace during online instruction due to a variety of needs such as cultural, linguistic, or receptive communication deficits. And it's really important as teachers that we're not only aware of this, but we acknowledge that this might be a challenge during e-learning for some students.
And that brings us to strategy number 13. Culturally responsive teachers will establish clear, consistent, and organized digital spaces. So maybe you remember at the start of the presentation, Marshall was talking about how culturally responsive teachers consider the brain. And in particular, we want to think about the stress levels of our students. We don't even know what our fall instruction entirely is going to look like, right? So I know teachers are feeling stress. Students are going to be feeling stressed too when we're in e-learning settings. And we're still in a pandemic, so there could be stresses related to COVID, and not even to mention all the other stresses that high schoolers deal with on a daily basis. So with that being said, when students are stressed out, that cortisol can be impacting their ability to really engage in their learning. We don't want our digital spaces to be an extra layer of stress for our students. So we want to do what we can to make sure that our digital spaces are consistent and predictable for our students to help bring those stress levels down. So we got a couple different things we can do to help make our spaces predictable and also make them consistent. So first, we actively got to teach our students how we organize our digital spaces. I know the school is strongly suggesting and even requiring people to use Google Classroom as a home location. So make sure you teach students how you organize that space. But if you decide to use a different platform, we'll have to teach students how to do that. I know in the spring, several students told me that using a daily agenda was really helpful to really lay down what the assignments were and the expectations for that. It's also important to consider, if you're using Google Classroom, to use that topics feature. That was something I actually didn't use in the spring, and I think it made it harder for my students. But I talked to several other teachers who use that topics feature to organize things by either unit or day of the week or other essential classroom resources, and it made it much easier for students to access the content that they needed. And of course, with that being said, clearly label your things either with the date or with a day number so students can access them. It's important with that technology then, so we got to make sure that that technology isn't becoming a barrier to our students' learning. So we got to make sure we help them understand the different spaces we're using.
Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get into breakout groups like Marshall shared earlier. We're going to discuss some of these questions, and looking at the time, we'll probably spend about 10 or so minutes in these breakout groups with 4 to 5 people. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and put you into a breakout room.